so happy we alive.
The fact is that anything you say is going to be used against you, and you have absolutely no obligation to make such statements. You should never confess to a marijuana-related offense, and I hope it goes without saying that you should never inform on any other human being who are not invited to sit there. Finally, one of your other constitutional rights which you should exercise is that precious First Amendment right of association. If you are not already a member of this association, a member of NORML, please join. Please join with us. You may feel that as one individual you cannot bring about change, but I guarantee you that working with the rest of us, we will bring about change. This conference already is shaping up to be one of, if not the most exciting conference that we've ever been privileged to sponsor here in the nation's capital. The people I've already met and talked with yesterday and last night have given me cause to believe we're going to hear some of the most exciting presentations that we have ever heard at any drug policy reform conference. As Keith said, we're going to be hearing from experts in every field associated with this issue, including doctors, lawyers, journalists, and professionals in every field related to this issue. There have been some extremely interesting and exciting developments related to marijuana reform during the past year. I'm just going to touch on a few of those during these few minutes. Since last we met, of course, the issue of medical marijuana has moved forward substantially. In those states which have already passed medical marijuana laws, the fight goes on to implement those laws. It's a very important fight to give meaning to the statutes that have now been passed by the voters in at least 6 states and the District of Columbia. To make those laws meaningful, it's going to require continued vigilance and continued work on behalf of all of us. And of course, in November, the state of Maine added its voice to voters across the country who have endorsed the concept that doctors and patients should have access to medical marijuana. The fact is that today, our government tells us that we can trust doctors and patients to responsibly use drugs which include cocaine, morphine, barbiturates, amphetamines, and hundreds of drugs which are truly potentially dangerous and addictive. Yet, that same government tells us that we cannot trust doctors and their patients with the relatively harmless herb, marijuana. That policy is irrational, and it will eventually fall, and our position will prevail. Governor Derek Johnson of New Mexico has given us all cause to hope that even other elected officials may eventually recognize the insanity of drug prohibition, the counterproductive, irrational approach to drug prohibition which has resulted in our nation imprisoning more of our citizens than any other nation on earth, except perhaps occasionally Russia. And I think that that is a scandal which should be the focus of continuing national attention. And yet we rarely hear that. We rarely hear in the mainstream press Americans reminded of the fact that our nation imprisons so many of our citizens, and the primary contributing factor to the dramatic increase in the imprisonment of our own people in recent decades has been the enforcement of drug prohibition, and primarily the enforcement of marijuana prohibition. We must put a stop to this insanity. The scandal which has surfaced in recent weeks involving the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy is one which I think will also ultimately result in very positive reforms. The fact is that the National Drug Control Policy suffered what should be a major embarrassment when it was revealed that they're spending our tax money to bribe national television networks to insert propaganda messages into the entertainment network programming. It's surely a small step from there to inserting that same message into the info entertainment programming, which disguises itself as news coverage, and even that which claims to be true news coverage is surely next. I am pleased to tell you that NORML has filed a complaint with the Federal Communications Commission, alleging that this practice violates federal law, and we intend to aggressively pursue that. One of the other dismaying developments in the past year is the fact that our Congress has passed an amendment to the Higher Education Act which says that if one has been convicted in a state or federal court of the possession of even a very small amount of marijuana or any other illegal drug, that person will lose eligibility for federal education assistance, lose eligibility for federal loans, for federal grants, or for work study assistance for higher education. What more counterproductive idea could these politicians come up with than to deny someone the right to further their education? How could even the most staunch prohibitionists rationally support the idea of denying an advanced education to people who may or may not have a problem with drugs? Well, we will not rest until that provision has been repealed. But until it is repealed, I want to tell you that there are steps that can be taken in your own communities which do not require great amounts of funding, which do not require a great large organization. In my hometown of Columbia, Missouri, a college town of approximately 100,000 citizens have taken it on themselves to take a preemptive strike against this Higher Education Act amendment. We are circulating a petition, and we are considering now circulating this petition with the target of putting the issue on the November 2000 ballot to require that all misdemeanor marijuana possession and paraphernalia possession charges be referred only to municipal courts. This is something which could be accomplished in virtually any city or municipality or in many counties throughout this nation. By citizens taking into their own hands the legislative process, we can force state and local legislators to deal with this issue and either to pass a provision which requires all these cases to go only to city courts, or we can put that issue before the voters, and I believe have a very good chance of persuading voters in even conservative communities to adopt the policy of sending these cases only to city courts where one does not suffer the loss of eligibility for federal education loans, grants, and work-study assistance. These brochures, by the way, will be available shortly outside on the tables at registration. So I urge you to pick these up, and if you have questions about this policy, about this approach to fighting the amendment to the Higher Education Act, please pick one of these up. Please feel free to talk to me during the conference or to call us for more information. I also want to point out to you that the rights I just spoke of, which each of us have, and which are especially important when dealing with law enforcement, are contained on this little green card. And we have these little green cards, and they will be available on the table out front. And the wording is not necessarily specifically what it needs to be in each case, but something like this card is a very valuable service for each normal chapter and each activist group to distribute to people, because it's so important to remember that advice, and it's so difficult to follow it when you're really in a situation where an overbearing police officer who's carrying a firearm is in your face and threatening you. There is also a very dismaying development in that the Congress is now considering a so-called methamphetamine bill. This so-called methamphetamine bill is actually far broader than dealing merely with the so-called scourge of methamphetamine. In fact, one of the most disturbing aspects of this bill is that, thanks to our own Missouri Senator John Ashcroft's efforts, that this bill contains a measure which would blatantly violate the First Amendment, which would prohibit the dissemination of information which might be used for the manufacture or cultivation of controlled substances. To make that a federal crime, to prohibit the dissemination of such information, not only through electronic media, not only through the internet, but through books, through magazines, through newspapers, through correspondence, or even through speaking. A more blatant violation of the First Amendment is difficult to imagine, and we will rely on our friends with the ACLU and others to challenge the legality of this measure if it passes, but it should not pass. And we should each contact our representatives in the Congress and urge them to defeat this obviously unconstitutional measure. You know, there is an oath that is taken by every judge, every prosecutor, every police officer, every person who holds public or appointed office in this nation virtually, which is an oath to uphold and preserve and defend the United States Constitution. And it is amazing how quickly that oath is violated by many, if not most, of those elected and appointed officials as soon as they take office. And this is just another example of that trend. Meanwhile, drug testing continues to assault the privacy of workers throughout this nation. I'm pleased to say that I think that the curve has begun to drop, and I think that many companies are beginning to recognize that drug testing is not only ineffective in accomplishing its stated goals, but it is expensive and virtually worthless if the employer is truly concerned about safety or productivity, because drug testing has nothing to do with safety or productivity, any more than controlling the off-work behavior of employees who might take a drink occasionally. So the employer has no more business trying to restrict the off-work activities of employers in the area of marijuana smoking than he does in the area of beer drinking. But what is more nefarious, and what is almost never acknowledged in the mainstream media, is that drug testing